the co-directors of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or IGMAP. Thank you so much for being here for our third public talk of a visiting practitioner this academic year. I want to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we are on the ancestral territory of the Oneida and Onondaga nations, two indigenous groups of people who continue to survive and resist the forces of settler colonialism in the United States. We're so excited, and it's been an amazing week this week to have Hanna with us. Hanna is the executive director of the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights and is doing absolutely incredible work documenting the most extreme forms of human rights violations that are occurring in one of the most, if not the most, closed societies in the world today. Hanna is a researcher, activist, and documenter of human rights violations in North Korea. She's currently executive director, as I said, of the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, or NKDB, based in Seoul, South Korea. NKDB's extensive database, compiled by interviewing over 20,000 escapees, is used to raise global awareness, conduct advocacy, and recommend policy with United Nations bodies, governments, INGOs, and international press. Hanna was appointed executive director of the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights in 2024 after over 9 years as a researcher, where she contributed to the repository published reports on human rights conditions in the military, humanitarian assistance sent to North Korea, and North Korea's obligations under UN mechanisms. Hanna's also served as Director of International Cooperation within NKDB, briefing diplomats, policymakers, and the news media on human rights in North Korea and managing international partnerships. She holds a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's from the University College Utrecht in the Netherlands. Please join me in welcoming Hanna Song.
Thank you, Carrie, for that very warm welcome, and thank you, all of you, for joining on the evening where you could very easily be watching your own version of a K-pop or K-drama, but you have another part of Korea that you're going to be hearing about today. As was introduced, I'm usually based in Seoul, South Korea, and I'm so used to talking to people who feel like they already know everything that's happening in the country. So this week has been such a joy to speak with many of you here, to hear about what you already know about North Korea, what you would like to know a little bit more of. And I'm really excited I want to go back to Seoul over the weekend, share with my colleagues about the really great conversations I've had the pleasure of having with some of the students here. Before we really get into what we do as an organization, why we do this, the struggles that we're having, the challenges we have, I want to start with a question of what comes to your mind when you think of North Korea? There's going to be some images that come into your head. First thought when you think of North Korea.
Security cameras.
Security cameras, yeah, interesting. Anybody else? Maybe somebody who I haven't spoken to this week, something that comes to your head. Maybe in the back there.
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un. If you Google North Korea, there's a lot of Kim Jong-un. It's a lot of militarization, it's a lot of nuclear weapons, it's a lot of, nowadays, Russia, which is interesting compared to if you Google South Korea, you get a lot of color, you get a lot of the city life, nature, a lot more diversity. And it's an important reminder of how differently these two Koreas are seen and have become perceived across the world. And for us as an organization, it's very important when we look at these images of North Korea to remind people that there is so much more to North Korea than a guy with a strange haircut. And so that's what we try to do at NKDB, is sharing a little bit more about the country that we know so little about. I don't know if you guys have seen this image before. It was a photo taken by NASA a few years ago that I think really highlights this challenge that we're working on. North Korea is a country that is surrounded by light and life and energy and information, and it's so isolated compared to what it's surrounded with. There's so much darkness in North Korea, but I don't know if that's also so representative of the people that live in the country. So a question that we as an organization have is, how do we bring light to North Korea, but also how do we get light out of North Korea as well? I think to really understand North Korea, we have to take a little bit step back of why North Korea became what it is today. And we have to go back to how the two Koreas became divided. South Koreans will not call themselves South Korean, they will just say they are Korean. North Koreans also will not say North Korean, they will say that they are Korean. By the UN standards, they are two separate countries, two separate member states. And this really happened where, if we understand that the Korea that for Koreans still is in their head, used to be occupied by the Japanese and was under a period of annexation and colonization for a few years until Japan lost in World War II. And the two major powers at the time decided that Korea as a country was not fit to rule itself yet, to govern itself. And so we would have the Soviet Union helping the North Koreans decide how they should be governed, and then the Americans on the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. And then in 1950, North Korea, with the support of the Soviet Union, invades South Korea with the goal of reunifying the two countries. And this idea of reunification will come up a few times throughout the presentation. What this led to was 3 years of a lot of back and forth of where this border was until 1953. There was an armistice agreement, and then a line was just drawn across what is known as the 38th parallel, leading to families being separated, and a war that technically has not ended until this day. During this time, it was really Kim Il-sung who was the driver of this war, but also the real driver of what Korea should look like in his eyes. I think this picture really also helps us really understand how North Korea has been able to survive against all odds until today. We have Kim Il-sung in the middle of this image, that propaganda image that is shown in lots of North Korean books and museums inside the country, where Kim Il-sung is really pictured as this loving father of a nation, and how he has created North Korea for what he considers to be his larger family. And then you have Kim Jong-il with his son on the edge there. Kim Il-sung was somebody who was trained in Manchuria, and also really was influenced by teachings of the Soviet Union when he established the DPRK, but he also took quite a different approach to what he believed socialism should be. North Korea says they have socialism in our own style. That's how they call it, and it's very much based on this cult of personality that we saw in that image before. A really important part of understanding North Korea is that, yes, North Korea has a constitution, North Korea has laws, but what's more important than the legal system that is put in place are Kim Il-sung's teachings, and also these 10 monolithic principles, which if you put them, if you analyze them, are very, very similar to the Ten Commandments that you'll see from the Bible. And this is a common theme that we see throughout the establishment of North Korea and how North Korea became the way it is and how it's been able to survive until now, is that Kim Il-sung and the founders of the DPRK really took elements of Christianity as a way of controlling its people, and it's really incremented in different parts of North Korean society as well. What really changes, I think, the way that we see North Korea and how we as a community grew is the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, where North Korea had been very dependent on the Soviet Union for their connection with the community, the world outside of the Korean Peninsula, and especially for resources. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea undergoes what is known as the Arduous March. It's a period of great famine, and there are different opinions in terms of when we would say that the Arduous March actually started, but many scholars will say that the Arduous March started in 1994, which is the year that Kim Il-sung died. Kim Il-sung was, of course, such an important part of North Korean society and the way that the North Korean people had a relationship to the state, that once he died, people were so much more focused on the fact that their great father had died rather than the famine itself, that it took a few years until we really began to see the after effects of the Arduous March. These images that you see here, I think, is quite representative of what the international community and also the North Korean people were faced with during this period known as the Arduous March, where you have, on one hand, young children starving. It's estimated that up to 3 million people died during this period, but till this day, we don't have any real data and nobody knows exactly how many people died. While on the other hand, you have a period in which Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, is trying to establish his power and his place in North Korean society and in leadership. And with him continuing to tell his people, we just need to march on during this period of hardship. And once we get through this arduous march, then we as a country will be prosperous and we will be able to unify the two Koreas. And that's where our work really started. Although the understanding the North Korean human rights situation, you have to understand, of course, the context in which North Korea as a country came to be. The North Korean human rights movement only really started in the late 1990s with the arduous march, because until then, we didn't really know what was happening inside North Korea, and we in South Korea were also dealing with our own human rights issues and democratization movement. The founders of our organization first started our work when they met a young North Korean boy who had crossed the border into China and seemed to not really understand where he was, but was just clearly in need of food and was clearly in need of a lot of support. And that's when we as an organization realized that the experiences that he was having was not just one-off experience, but it was happening to thousands, millions of people still in North Korea, which made it very important for us to realize how important it was to document these stories. Going back to why it was only in the late 1990s and early 2000s that the North Korean human rights movement came to be, I think you can see that through this chart. From 1953, when the armistice was signed, until 1998, so for about 40 years, we had less than 1,000 people coming from North Korea. And then suddenly, from 1998 onwards, every year we have up to 1,000, 2,000, and then the peak is nearly 3,000 people coming. And then again, we start to see the numbers drop, which we can come back to later, around 2011, 2012, which is when Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, comes into power. But it was during this large wave of North Koreans coming to South Korea is when major organizations started to do their work and started to really understand what was happening inside the country. We started our work as a documentation organization, and that is still very much one of the most important things that we do. Hence the name of our organization, the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. And we were very much inspired by the work that was being done in Germany just a few years before our organization was established. The West German government had created the Salzgitter archives, where they were documenting what was happening in East Germany, and it was used in the process of transitional justice with the two Germanys unified. The founders of our organization went to the South Korean government and said, North Korea is going to collapse. We need to do what the Germans have done, and we need to document so that when there is a collapse of the system and there has to be transitional justice, we have the evidence and information collected. The South Korean government was like, we don't really want to do that, but you guys go ahead. You guys create your database, and we will create an environment in which you can do so. So the way that we started doing our work is when North Koreans first come to South Korea, they spend 3 months in a place called Hanna, which is a resettlement facility run by the Ministry of Unification, run by the South Korean government. That's where they spend 3 months learning what the internet is, what an ATM is, how to be South Korean. And it's during this time where we have an agreement with the South Korean government in which we can go and conduct human rights investigations and ensure that these stories are not being forgotten. So we collect information by conducting interviews. We categorize them according to different international human rights treaties, especially taking into consideration not just the ones that North Korea has ratified, but those that we can also use as an indicator to see what type of atrocities are happening inside the DPRK. For us, we say that we collect all cases connected to North Korean human rights. North Korean human rights to us is not just what happens to North Koreans inside North Korea, but it's also what happens to North Koreans outside of the border, in China, in Russia, but also what the North Korean government is doing as a perpetrator of human rights violations. For Americans, you may remember that there was a young American student that was detained for trying to steal a propaganda poster when he went to visit Pyongyang, and he was a student of the University of Virginia. Otto Warmbier was detained, and once he was eventually released, he was already in a comatose state and died shortly after he returned back to the United States. So that would also be a case that we would document in our database. Over the past 20 years, we've managed to document over 80,000 cases of human rights violations, and this means that we have the largest repository of North Korean human rights records globally. It's also maybe connected with the fact that we have been doing this work the longest out of any other human rights documentation group. And we also collect information on individuals related to North Korean human rights. So an individual could be a victim, could be a witness or a perpetrator, but their information is also documented to ensure that their stories are not being forgotten and can be used for a future transitional justice process. There are about 35,000 North Koreans that have come to South Korea, successfully resettled. but we have 56,000 entries of individuals. So that means we are not just documenting about individual experiences, but also if people have witnessed something in North Korea. So as a result, because some of the information that we are collecting on our database have implications for people still in North Korea, our database is not made public because of security concerns that there may potentially be also repercussions to people still in North Korea. And so, as I mentioned, we take the information and we categorize it into 16 categories, different 85 types. And this is a methodology that was developed by an organization called Curidocs, which is an organization based in Geneva. But over time, we have kind of adjusted the methodology to be a bit more in line with what we're starting to see in North Korea. Just a brief glimpse into our database. So that with the 16 categories, you'll see that most of the data that is being collected is related to the rights to individual dignity and liberty. And if we take a deeper look at what the right to individual dignity and liberty means, it's most of the cases that we're documenting are related to illegal detention. And I think this also shares a little bit more about, especially for those of you who are quite interested in human rights research and the methodology that is used, to be very transparent. It also shows a lot about the sample that we are working with. So many of the North Korean escapees that we interview have experiences of human rights violations that they experience on their journey of escaping North Korea or their attempts to escape. This lady, the first time she was taken into a state security department, she didn't even make it across the border, but she was caught trying to escape and was detained and also tortured during the process. This testimony that we collected is also about somebody who didn't even make it out of North Korea, but his sister told us about her brother being detained in North Korea and also suffering from a lot of mental problems when he was in North Korea because of his detention. So this is an example of a testimony that we would collect, and the way that we do this is by interviewing North Korean escapees, and then there would be like a long transcript, and we would be extracting human rights violations, and then based on one testimony, we could be extracting several cases of human rights violations. As our database is not made public, we still think it's very important that people are able to still use the data that we collect and the research that we do to also influence different types of policy as well. So we publish annual reports and thematic reports. A report that just came out by my colleagues yesterday is, for example, on the digital surveillance of North Koreans in China. And 3 weeks ago, we published a report about North Koreans in Russia. So again, we're not just looking about the human rights violations that North Koreans experience within their country, but also across borders as well. This is one of my favorite projects that we have done, which we have unfortunately had to temporarily shut down because it was a project that was being funded by the US State Department, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, the human rights community have been very affected by the funding cuts recently. But something that we also do as an organization is document locations of where sites of human rights violations. And we would use satellite imagery to do so. And some of this data used to be shown on a platform called the Visual Atlas. We're currently looking for funding to get this up and running again. But then you can see how different areas in North Korea have different human rights violations, and also you can also see how en route of escaping from North Korea will also lead to different human rights violations as well. So I think it's something that's, again, quite important for researchers and people who are interested in understanding how we do this human rights work to see is there needs to be awareness of the sample that we are working with in the data that we are collecting as well. You'll see that most of the human rights violations that we are documenting, you'll see the dark blue navy part there, which is North Hamgyong province, and 70% of the people that are in South Korea are from North Hamgyong province. So does that mean there are more human rights violations happening in North Hamgyong province, or does it mean just because we've spoken to more people from North Hamgyong province that's why we have a higher percentage? I think there are a few ways of looking at it. One would be that there actually are more human rights violations happening in border towns. One would be that border towns are where a lot of information is smuggled through, and so for Kim Jong-un, one of the things that he is most afraid of is the influence that South Korean culture has on North Korean people. And while we get to enjoy watching Korean dramas on Netflix and listening to K-pop, for North Korean people, they will be detained, sometimes even executed for doing so. And so many of the human rights violations that are documented near these border towns are actually because most of the information flows through these areas, and so you'll experience different types of violations for the contact you have there. But it's also because, as I showed you before, it's also how people are able to escape from North Korea. The closer you are to the border, the not easier, but the more access you have in being able to leave the country. So despite the fact that North and South Korea are connected across land, very, very close to each other, very, very few people will come directly from North to South Korea. They will have to go through a third country. So this image here allows you to see a very typical route that North Koreans will take. They will have to cross the border into China and then go through Southeast Asia, and eventually you have to try and get to Thailand, where the Thai authorities will connect you with the South Korean embassy there. Before Thailand, China, Cambodia, Laos will, because of their close relationships with the North Korean government, they will forcibly repatriate you back to North Korea, where, as we saw in one of the testimonies before, you will be taken in, interrogated, tortured, and detained for having committed this treasonous act of leaving the country. What's also quite interesting here, you see we have Myung-hee's journey and Sung-mi's journey. Myung-hee left in October 2010, and it took her 4 years to get to South Korea. She arrived in South Korea in January 2014. Myung-hee was trafficked into China, and in China was sold to a Chinese man who did not allow her to leave the home. And if you are caught by Chinese authorities, as I mentioned, you will not be granted refugee status or even considered to be a refugee. You will be sent back to North Korea. So she spent 3 years in hiding, trying to find that network that would allow her to support her to cross all these borders without any identification. But then you have Sung-mi, who left North Korea in May 2019 and arrived in May 2020. It took her just about a year to get to South Korea. Sung-mi is Myung-hee's daughter. So Myung-hee had already arrived in South Korea. She was able to earn some money to pay a broker that would allow her daughter to travel through China and Southeast Asia with a little bit more protection. And that is the case. That is something that we started seeing a little bit more of until 2020, when things really changed under the COVID-19 pandemic. And another issue that we have to deal with, of course, I think, as I mentioned, is how the changing relations between North Korea and China really affects the North Korean people. So I want to quickly just show you this animation that our organization created about an issue that we particularly have been a little bit more interested in recent years.
2023년 6월 중국에 구금된 탈북민 600에서 2,000명, 2023년 10월 600명의 탈북민 북송, 2024년 3월 22일 전 세계에서 각 인권 사안을 모니터링하는 유엔 특별보고관들이 중국 정부에 탈북민에 대한 24명화 강제 북송을 우려하는 공개 소환을 보냈다. 왜 북한 주민들의 자국 송환을 유엔이 우려할까? 북한은 체제를 유지하기 위해 주민들의 사상과 동향을 감시하고 통제하는 여러 층의 감시 체계를 운영하고 있으며 물리적으로도 강력한 통제 방안을 구축하고 있다. 국경 통제는 코로나 팬데믹 이후 과거보다 더 사법해져 공수에 이르렀고 2020년 당국은 국경 경비대가 국경을 넘어 탈북하는 주민에 대해 현장 사살을 할 수 있도록 허용해 오늘날까지 이어지고 있다. 그럼에도 불구하고 생존과 자유를 향한 탈북은 지속되어 왔다. 당국은 통제라는 1차적인 방법에서 벗어나 국경 밖으로의 이동을 실천한 주민들을 2차적 방법인 처벌로 대응하고 있다. 북한 헌법 제260조는 탈북 이유를 막론하고 국경 비법 출입죄를 노동 단련형, 심할 경우 최대 5년 이하의 노동 교화형으로 처벌한다고 규정하고 있다. 동시에 형법은 공민이 조국을 배반하고 다른 나라로 도망쳤다고 판단되는 경우는 형법 제63조에 해당됨을 명시하고 있으며 이는 5년 이상의 노동교화형에 처하고 정상이 특히 무거운 경우에는 무기노동교화형 또는 사형 및 재산 몰수형에 처한다고 규정하고 있다.
내가 탈북을 한 이유는 사람답게 살기 위함이었다. 그런데 체포된 후 나는 끔찍한 일들을 겪었고 또 목격했다. 5년 전 탈북해 중국에 살고 있던 나는 누군가의 밀고로 새벽에 갑자기 체포돼 공안의 조사를 받고 요명성에 있는 단동 변방대대에 구금됐다. 여기서부터 모든 악몽이 시작됐다. 나와 함께 30명이 더 구금되어 있었고 우리는 평안북도 신주에 있는 국가안전보위부로 이송됐다. 처음 보위부에 들어서자마자 우리 모두 옷이 다 벗겨진 채 숨긴 돈이나 물건이 없는지 몸수색을 당했다. 그리고 곧 조사가 시작됐다. 보위부는 정치범 조국 반역자를 색출하려고 모든 걸 다 동원했다. 나도 조사 때 몽둥이 의자 그리고 손과 발로 얼굴, 허리, 다리를 사정없이 맞았다. 온몸이 피투성이가 되고 퉁퉁 부었다. 지금도 걸을 때 한쪽 다리를 잘 못 쓴다. 그리고 실제로 한국행을 하다가 잡힌 사람, 교회를 갔다는 사람들이 있었는데 조사를 받다가 폭행을 너무 심하게 당해서 죽은 사람도 있었고 그리고 어떤 사람들은 바로 사라졌는데 나중에 들어보니 평생 나올 수 없는 정치범 수용소에 가는 거라고 했다. 그렇게 일주일 정도 조사가 끝나고 나는 신의주 집결소로 옮겨져 아픈 몸으로 노동을 하며 2달을 기다리다가 고향에 있는 보안소로 이송되었다. 보안소 구류장에서는 허울뿐인 예실과 재판을 기다렸고 변론할 기회도 없이 난 교화 사면을 받았다. 이후 교화소로 이송됐고 공민증도 박탈당했다. 교화소에는 북송돼서 형기를 받은 여자들이 많았다. 알고 보니 1990년대 말부터 탈북이 급증하면서 중국에서 북송된 사람들을 교화소에 가두느라 규모가 증설됐다고 들었다. 교화소는 환경이 너무 한심해서 살아서 나올 수 있을 거라고 생각을 못했다. 모든 게 다 열악하고 뼈에 가죽만 남아있는 사람들이 너무 많았다. 나도 처음에 보위부에서 맞은 후유증이랑 허약으로 고생을 하다가 겨우 살아났다. 허약, 위생 문제로 인한 감염, 질병, 열악한 노동 환경, 치료 미비 등의 이유로 하루에 2-3명씩은 사망하는 걸 목격했다. 1년에 700명 정도가 죽어나갔다고 시체 처리반에 있던 한 수감자가 얘기해줬다. 시신은 창고에 쌓아두었다가 산에서 한 번에 불태웠다고 들었다. 살아남았지만 아직 그때의 기억들이 생생하다.
죽음의 위협이 토사리는 강제 북송을 경험한 후 다시 탈북을 감행한 수많은 북한 이탈 주민이 직접 경험하고 목격한 사실들을 증언하고 있다. 그리고 많은 사람들이 당시에 경험한 트라우마로 지금도 고통을 호소하고 있다. 국제법상 강제 송환이 되었을 경우 박해받을 가능성이 있는 사람에 대한 강제 송환은 금지되어 있으며 중국도 고문 방지 협약 가입국으로 이 원칙을 준수할 의무가 있다. 하지만 탈북민의 증언을 바탕으로 8,230건의 강제 송환 사건을 기록하고 있는 북한 인권정보센터는 강제 송환 중 98.9%가 중국에서 그리고 나머지가 러시아 및 기타 지역에서 발생했다고 보고하고 있다. 중국은 탈북민을 경제적 난민, 불법 체류자로 일축하며 북한으로 강제 송환을 시행하고 있는데 70년이 넘는 시간 동안 단 한 명의 탈북민도 불법 체류자에서 예외를 두지 않았다. 세계 인권 선언은 모든 사람은 자국 내에서 이동 및 거주의 자유에 대한 권리를 가지며 자국을 포함하여 어떠한 나라를 떠날 권리와 또한 자국으로 돌아올 권리를 가진다고 선언하고 있다. 의식조차 되지 않을 만큼 일상적인 무관심 속에 수많은 탈북민은 지금 바로 이 시간에도 생명을 위협받는 북송의 공포를 견디며 살아가고 있다.
So this is as you can see in this video, something that is very important for us to be able to do our work is the cooperation that we have with the international community. To also use international human rights law to show that what is happening to North Korean refugees, in this instance they are refugees, against the obligations that different member states have taken themselves. So NKDB not just uses its consultative status at the UN, but also something that we have done is in recent years is also going to Congress to also share about the US's collective responsibility to also stop these things from happening. I won't spend too much time on this, but before a lot of the work that we had done, which has maybe shifted in more recent years, is really using the UN as a platform to what we thought would be advancing the human rights situation in North Korea and as a way to get the international community to take a little bit more action. And we can talk maybe a little bit about why the strategies that we have taken have changed a little bit over time, but just maybe some a quick historical overview is that the UN passed the first resolution on North Korean human rights when it was then the Commission on Human Rights in 2003, and the UN General Assembly has passed a resolution on North Korean human rights for the past 20 years. It is one of the only country-specific resolutions that gets passed every year with consensus without a vote, and that I think also shows how much until now the international community, member states have really understood, and nobody has really denied that the human rights situation is dire. The North Koreans' response has always been that this on the left is an excerpt from a news article that the North Koreans published on North Korean media, and about how these human rights resolutions are imperialist campaigns, anti-DPRK campaigns, and that the information that was being used to pass these resolutions are based on interviews with North Korean escapees that they call on their own public media human scum or rubbish like mongrel dogs. So this is how the North Korean government refers to North Korean escapees. So something that as a community, it was very important to us was to show that it was not just us NGOs that are finding this information, but we also needed independent experts to also join in raising awareness on this issue. So since 2004, we've had 4 special rapporteurs on North Korean human rights from various countries. And I should have translated this into English, but so we have Vitit from Thailand, Mazuki from Indonesia, Thomas from Argentina, and Elizabeth from Peru. And the background of where these people come from is quite important because their role as special rapporteurs is not just to criticize the human rights situation, but also to look for ways in which they can engage with the North Korean people are waking up in Korea, so they're starting to call me. So their role is also to engage try to engage with the North Korean government on how they can improve on their human rights situation. The way that the role of special rapporteurs when it comes to North Korean human rights is one to publish 2 reports every year in Geneva and in New York at the Human Rights Council and General Assembly. But of course, they, as you can see, all 4 of them until now have not been Korean. Purposefully, they haven't been South Korean because no way would the North Koreans even respond to anything that a South Korean would say. But because they're not Korean, they are not able to speak with North Korean escapees with this language barrier. They're not based in South Korea, they're all based in their respective countries. And so again, it's been very important for NGOs to continue to publish information so that it can be reported and included in special rapporteur reports. So this picture here is with Elizabeth Valmont, who is the current special rapporteur, and she came to visit NKDB earlier this year. A real turning point for the community was even with the special rapporteur's reports, even with the resolution that was being passed every year, we could see that the international community was starting to lose interest and could also, they were confronted with the issue that North Korea continued to say that this was a very political campaign that was being put on by South Korean NGOs. So we advocated as a community to create a commission of inquiry where an independent mechanism at the UN could investigate. So not based on NGO reports, but they themselves could conduct these interviews. And so a panel was put together in 2013, and we had Mazuki, who was special rapporteur at the time, Michael Kirby, who is was an Australian judge, and Sonia Bezerko, who was a human rights activist from Serbia. And they, for a year, put together this very extensive report. This is Michael Kirby, who I think now he's in maybe his late 80s, and he still carries around this like 300-page report on the findings that he found during his time. It's an extensive report, so we're not going to read the report, but we'll look at the conclusions of the report. And for many of you, it might just seem like another UN report, but for the community, it was considered to be a landmark report, and it was a huge win for us. Because if we look at the conclusion, it says that the systematic, widespread, and grave human rights violations that are happening in North Korea constituted crimes against humanity. Until this point, they were just concerns about the grave human rights situation. They were not calls for action of what we should be doing in this response to these grave human rights violations that were happening. But in this UI report, the UN recommended that the international community refer the situation via the Security Council to the International Criminal Court. And that really changed the way that I think the community began to respond to the issue. And a large focus began to be on how do we get Kim Jong-un to the ICC? And a lot of money and resources were spent doing that. Kim Jong-un has not been referred to the ICC, and there haven't been actually major moves to do so. So this is even in that first photo that we saw of Kim Jong-un, you can already see like within the 10 years he has changed so much as well. But what we've been what we as an organization had in a way also been guilty at as well was just looking at the international community to do more, waiting for them to refer Kim Jong-un to the ICC, and for 10 years that wasn't happening. So starting from maybe a year or two ago, we've started also exploring how we as a community can be taking things into our own hands a little bit more. So for the first time, we, with Ms. Chen Young, who's right in the middle there, filed a case in the South Korean court to on the human rights violations that she has experienced. She was forcibly repatriated to North Korea 3 times while she was trying to escape to South Korea. And I think what was also really important for us was that the lawyer on the furthest left, Mr. Lee is also from North Korea. He's the first North Korean escapee to ever pass the bar exam in South Korea. So he's the first North Korean escapee to ever become a lawyer. And so for him to be working on this case when he left North Korea when he was 9 years old and was in China also for a long time without his parents, was also a very meaningful step that we were taking. We filed this case in July, and the South Koreans are really struggling to understand what to do with this case because they claim jurisdiction over North Korea, but what that actually means in reality, nobody seems to understand that anymore. So we're waiting for in South Korea, it's very important that the prosecutor office, kind of like how it works at the ICC, for them to open up a case. And they've just been throwing it around saying, you guys look at it first, or you guys look at it first. But this is something that we've been working on until again, maybe taking a step back, we realized that one, we were looking at the international community too much as a way of, they will figure it out. But two, when we tried to look for victims to come forward to try and join this case, Ms. Che was the only one willing to do so, despite the fact that we have interviewed over 20,000 victims, we have 87,000 cases in our database. She was the only person willing to do it. And we met Ms. Che because she received counseling from our organization. So she's been in South Korea for more than 10 years, but it took her those 10 years with counseling to also realize what she wanted to do, and also how important it was for her voice to be included in this movement. Unfortunately, though, despite the clear needs of psychosocial support for victims from North Korea, it hasn't been something that has been so widely accepted, one from South Koreans, but also for North Korean escapees as well. But we've been fortunate to receive funding from the UN Fund for Victims of Torture for the past 10 years to work with victims. And an important tool that we use is narrative exposure therapy, which is a tool that is often used with victims of torture, where you draw a timeline of your life, and I think this picture is switched around, but you not just mark the stones with the negative impacts of trauma, but also you use things like flowers or other things that are bring positive images, to also remember what are moments in your life that brought you joy. And I think that has been very powerful for North Korean escapees to kind of reclaim their own narrative and have a better understanding of what they want the world to know about North Korea. And so after doing these narrative exposure therapies, our counseling team works with them to write these storybooks. Most of the time, these storybooks are just given to the victims themselves that they just keep. But sometimes they are published for that people can purchase and people can read. And this particular storybook is about a young woman who I think I can just show you in a video here. this is the lady who we wrote the book with, where she was taken in for having watched a South Korean drama and tortured and detained. And the lady sitting next to her was her music professor who was asked to spy on her to see if she was watching South Korean dramas. Both of them were detained and eventually decided to leave North Korea together and had to leave their family members behind. You can see she's quite a young woman, but she felt a lot of guilt of not being able to say goodbye to her husband and her son, and she really struggled with this sense of guilt when she came to South Korea. So she worked with our counseling team to write a storybook, which is the one that I showed you here, and with that we have also created a digital exhibition of his story. But what's really been powerful is that not just through this storybook has she been able to reclaim the way that she wants to talk about North Korea, but she was a singer in North Korea, and only after going through this counseling with us has she started also singing again. So this is just I'll just show you a snippet of her singing. She ended up going on a South Korean TV show to tell his story, yeah, I'll just show you a few seconds of it.
들소들이 튀고 노루사슴 노는 그곳에 나의 집 지어준 걱정 근심 없고 구름 한 점 없는 그곳에 나의 집 지어준 온도의 집 노루사슴이 뛰
I'll just pause it there, but what is quite interesting about the way that they sing is that they sing in a South Korean style, because they were trained to sing propaganda songs to the South that were used on the loudspeakers that you have across the demilitarized zone, but they had to use South Korean style of singing with North Korean propaganda lyrics. And so the lady who's playing the piano is Chung-jin, who wrote the book, and the lady who was singing with her was her music professor who defected. They defected together, and so they have a really beautiful story in which they've kind of made a family of their own now living in South Korea. I'm gonna have to do this again. But something that we really realized with when working with Chung-jin was how, despite the psychosocial support that we are providing them, despite the human rights activism that had been that we were doing, still many North Koreans did not feel like they could share their stories publicly. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the way that North Korean human rights is politicized in South Korea. South Koreans do not learn about North Korea about the human rights situation. They really only learn about North Korea through a lens of unification as a country eventually that we're going to unify with, and why it's so important to unify. And so we provide these education programs that we have been doing, that we run. They're like 12-week programs where anybody can come and learn about the human rights situation, and they also get to speak with North Korean state peace. But something that we were really realizing was that the people who were coming to our programs were people who already, and we were preaching to the choir. They already had a little bit of an interest in North Korea. So how can we speak to a larger audience, and how can we really create a space in which the victims felt like their voices were not being forgotten or put aside or erased, but that the education could also be used as a way for South Koreans to play a larger role in society. So something that we've been trying to do and working on is trying to create a museum on North Korean human rights. And at the moment, we run a small exhibition where it's a small space where people can watch videos and testimonies that we've been able to gather from North Korean escapees, but also through this small space, I think we've seen how powerful these spaces can be for students, but also when we have different delegations coming in to South Korea. So the lady on the furthest right bottom was the former US Special Envoy, Ambassador Julie Turner, on North Korean human rights. And so having the fact that we know so much about North Korea now, and there are so many cases that are being documented, and in a place like Seoul, there is no place for people to go and learn and hear the voices of victims, is something that I think is still quite shocking to us. And so this is a project that we have been working on for a few years, and it's especially been quite important to us. And I think this is maybe where I will, with this, the last point that I'll make is, especially considering the very challenging times that it is in working on North Korea. One of the first, I think, images I showed you was the number of North Koreans have been able to enter South Korea, and we saw the numbers had really been quite high for a while. But after 2020, we've had the numbers coming in have been in the hundreds, but these are not people who have come directly from North Korea. These are people who have been in China for a very, very long time. And this project that we did with Reuters, I think really shows why that is. So this is satellite imagery. We use satellite imagery to see the way that North Korea has built these electric fences and concrete walls across these borders. So the yellow squiggles that you can see are new fences and new walls that have been built since 2020. And that is to stop people from leaving the country and also stopping information from getting in. Why does North Korea want to stop people from leaving the country? Because once they leave, they are able to share about their experiences, which leads to NGOs like ours documenting these experiences, taking these stories to the UN, filing them in courts, and it gives Kim Jong-un a bad image, which is exactly something that he's trying to change, in which, as a man who grew up in Switzerland, that has his education in Switzerland, he really wants to be the head of a normal state, and he wants to normalize relations with the international community, and one way of doing that is stopping the world from really, really knowing what's happening in the country. So with the blockage of information getting out, and also North Korea's growing ties with Russia in recent years, I think we're in a period of time where we as a community are really thinking about how different the North Korea that is there now is compared to the North Korea that we were working on when this movement first started in the late 1990s. This is I don't know if you can see, this is a poem, a part of a poem that one of the North Korean escapees that did our counseling program wrote, that we have at our exhibition, where she wrote it in Korean, but translated: the unseen does not mean they do not exist. The unheard do not mean there are no cries. Their stories can be erased and their voices can be silenced, but may their voices be heard, their stories remembered, and the light of truth shine into the darkness. And again, with the first image that we started with, where North Korea, I think, is very easy to forget about, because we don't have images coming out. You can't really visit North Korea, and now there are no North Koreans leaving the country either. But when we know that there are these atrocities happening, how are we as a community going to respond? And I think that's perhaps where I would like to, a thought that I'd like to leave you all with before I open it up to any questions that you may have about North Korea, about the work that we do. And just very lastly, if you are interested in some more resources that we have, the last website, thelarkivian.org, is where we have a lot of those digital exhibitions that I showed you before, but also on your way in, on your way out, you can pick up one of the postcards that I brought, which has a QR code that connects you to a digital exhibition that we have on our platform. But I'll stop here because I know I've been speaking for a while to open it up for any comments or questions. I'm surprised you have more questions. We spent the whole week together. No, please.
Sorry for that, but thank you for this wonderful presentation. I guess something to ask. What does it mean for NKDB consultative status with ECOSOC, and how does this actually support your work?
Yeah, it's a good question because it took us 12 years to get consultative status, and we thought it would change everything. It has changed nothing. We had applied for consultative status even before I joined the organization, because we thought having access to the UN, having a grounds pass to the UN, being able to deliver these oral statements we thought it would really change the paradigm in which we were working in. So the reason why it took us so long to get it was every time we submitted our application, we had countries like Iran or Cuba or China or friends of North Korea asking really, really detailed, specific questions about our organization that meant it kept getting deferred. So we were never denied the status, it was deferred just for 10 plus years. Eventually, the US embassy, the US government, maybe I think it was 2 years ago, along with NKDB and a few other organizations realized that there really was no reason why we shouldn't get consultative status, so called this emergency vote, and that allowed us to eventually get it. But during that time, when we didn't have consultative status, we also started partnering up with different international organizations, like we're a member of FIDH, which is a French international organization. We partner up a lot with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, who are happy to provide us with that grounds pass for us to do our advocacy on the ground. Additionally, in terms of writing, making submissions to the UN on different conventions or treaties, you can still do that without ECOSOC status. So it's actually more about, I think, the prestige that it's meant to bring, and the donors like it, and your board will like it. But in terms of, to be very transparent in how is it more effective in our advocacy? Not really. We managed to do a lot of UN advocacy without ECOSOC consultative status. I think if you're able to find a good network and community that are able to support the work that you do, you're able to effectively share the voices of the community that you're working with to the UN without it. If you have it, it's great, use it well, but it's not something that I would spend a ton of resources on trying to get again, in hindsight. Yes, Charlie.
Thank you so much for being with us. I was wondering if there are any sort of allied organizations that you work with that are based in China.
No, that's a good question. It's something that we have really tried to do. When we first started, we weren't working with organizations that were well established. China also has difficult relationship with civil society as well. But more actually, those who have quite a significant presence in helping North Koreans in China are actually churches. And so when we first started doing research on forced repatriation, we were using church networks who had a lot of sources of understanding what was happening across the border in China. But China has also changed a lot in recent years in their crackdown of religious groups, of even more civil society. So a lot of the partners we had on the ground have actually left China. So it's been quite difficult. But something that we are doing more recently is trying to partner up with more Chinese diaspora groups to think about how China's changing human rights situation is also affecting different minority groups. So working with Uyghurs or working with Tibetans has been quite helpful for us to show a little bit more, to show more solidarity. But it's something that we're doing that's quite new for us to be doing. Yeah.
What work have you done, would you say, is most effective in garnering international support and sympathy for the cause and for your organization?
I think I think it depends how you measure that indicator. For many, for example, a big win that they consider is that the US passed North Korean Human Rights Act in 2004. It's the first country to do so. And that was made possible because President George W. Bush had read a memoir about a North Korean person in a political prison camp, and he was really shaken by that. And he's continued to really be quite devoted to the issue, where at the Bush Center in Texas, one of the more senior researchers is one of the first North Koreans to ever become a refugee in the US. And so he, through the North Korean Human Rights Act in the US, we've been able to congressionally appropriate a certain amount of money that goes to fund North Korean human rights work, but also has created a pathway for North Koreans to be able to come to the US. So if North Koreans are in Thailand, the only countries that they can have a specific pathway that they can choose from would be South Korea and the US. Some consider that to be, a really, really big win. That was in 2004, and that was really, but I think maybe a commonality would be, it's so much more powerful and impactful when it's the North Korean people speaking directly, when the victims are speaking directly, whether that's through a memoir, whether that's through a speech at the UN, whether that's through song. And that's, again, why we have been trying to create this museum, because until now we've done lots of very professional research reports and conferences, and it's great, but you have the same people coming, and it doesn't seem to move people the way and to lead to different types of action. And I think we're at a point where we really need to be a little bit more creative in the way that we have been doing our work. So what our organization has been focusing on a little bit more in recent years is, again, how do we get victims to be more at the center of the work that we do? How do we be more victim-centered so that they really take on more of a leadership position in this movement, given the fact that we were founded by South Koreans. I'm South Korean. All of the big organizations are led by South Koreans, not North Koreans.
So one of the things that I've been interested in throughout the week as you've been talking is this idea that South Koreans don't really think about North Korea that much, because I think here in the US we actually think about it a lot, or at least maybe more than it seems like South Korea does. And I know you mentioned the other day that some media, like the James Bond movies, used to depict the villain always being from North Korea. And I kind of think there's still an interest in media, like Western media, with North Korea. So I was curious, how does South Korean media depict North Korea, or do they not at all? I know you mentioned that one movie the other day, the crash landing on you, but yeah, is there more depictions of North Korea in media or?
Yeah, maybe for those who haven't been in the conversations that we've been having, I've been mentioning one of the things that I think shocked me the most, having grown up overseas, and when I came to South Korea to wanting to work on this issue, and I said that thinking that there'd be a whole community with a very strong network and system of people working on those human rights, I was met with, what? Like, why? Why would you come? Like, that's such a strange thing to be interested in and working on. And so I find myself sometimes also, for a while, I would censor myself as well. When people ask me what I did for work, I would just say, I'm a researcher, not on North Korean human rights. But I met with a very different response when I go overseas and say I work on North Korean human rights. What is quite interesting is a slide that I skipped over was every year we do a survey with 1,000 South Koreans on the level of interest on North Korean human rights. And 65.5% say, oh, we're interested. And then if you look on the reasons for why they're interested, 34% will say because we feel so sorry for these North Korean people. 16% say it's because we're one nation. That number is interesting because that has been going down and down every year. But then we also ask them, for those people who are not interested, it's because we can't really do anything about it. Another stat that I didn't put in the slide is what have you done in response to the North Korean human rights issue? Have you participated in a campaign before? Or, are you aware of any North Korean human rights organizations? I didn't put it on the slide because the figures are always very embarrassingly low of when this interest translates into action. A reason I think for this of maybe defending the South Koreans a little bit is that, again, if we remember this North Korea has been an issue on their mind, has been this thing that they've had to deal with since the 50s. And if South Korea was as focused on whether North Korea was going to continue to be a threat because of their nuclear weapons, on what South Korea should be doing in response to North Korea, if they put as many resources into that, South Korea would not be the economically developed country it is today. That being said, now that we are in a position to, I think, play a bigger role in the global community, I think that should change. But the way that I think South Korean media depicts North Koreans is not so different from how they are portrayed in Hollywood, but the video I showed you here is an interesting program that is quite controversial in South Korea. It's called Now On My Way to Meet You, and it's a panel of just North Korean escapees. It's sometimes, and I'll turn the sound off, but it's sometimes we might see. Some people don't like this show because they tend to put together just a panel of what they consider to be very beautiful North Korean women, and they a lot of the stories are very, very dark, and there's a lot of crying on this show, and so some people like Chongjin, who went on the show, she never went back on it again because she felt very pressured by the producers and the way that it was edited, that it was only showing this very negative aspect of her life, and it was this big sob fest, which she didn't feel comfortable in. But this is how a lot of South Koreans get to know North Korean defenders. It's quite a popular TV show, and they'll have a panel of mostly young North Korean women who talk about very, very like dark moments in their lives, and it's for entertainment purposes. So it's so the way that people get to learn about North Korean media is just Kim Jong-un with the missiles, or the only way that they see people of North Korea is through these TV shows. But what has changed, and I think we started speaking about this in some of the classes, was that in response to these shows, there now has been a growth of North Korean born YouTubers, North Korean skating YouTubers, who are trying to use YouTube as a way to share the stories that they want to share, like replaying their narrative, which has been really interesting in seeing how then that has led to younger South Koreans being a little bit more interested in North Korea through YouTube, because they wouldn't watch shows like this.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I just had a question about, it's semi-related to the last two questions, that is about the perception of North Koreans, but specifically in South Korea. You mentioned very briefly that, that the government provides services a few months for integration of North Korean activities to integrate into South Korean society. One, my question would be like, how effective is it and how well integrated North Korean escapees are able to be in South Korean society? Because from my knowledge is that North Korean accent is slightly different from South Korean, and it's distinguishable from a Korean speaker, and that people are sometimes not necessarily targeted, but at least singled out for their accents. And even like, because as you were saying, like with the singer who sung in South Korean style, like basically how well the integration goes, and whether they face any obstacles within South Korea even when they get there, and is there anything that either your organization or other organizations do to solve those barriers?
Yeah. So in addition to the 3 months of education that they receive, North Koreans get automatic citizenship, so they don't have any legal protection barriers. They get housing, they get vocational training, they can go to university for free. There's lots of systems that have been put in place that essentially shows for the South Korean government, they've financially invested a lot. I think that the issue comes with, does that translate into how North Koreans feel that they feel well resettled into their country? You know, we say that the South Korean government has just thrown money at the issue without thinking about what it is that have led to barriers for North Korean escapees. They haven't addressed the fact that South Koreans are still have this very prejudiced view of North Koreans. I think I shared with some of you that for people who grew up 1950s, 60s, 70s until the early 80s, if you were at school, you were drawing North Koreans with like horns on their heads. They were very much dehumanized and seen to be the enemy. And so for North Korean escapees, they do try to hide who they are, try to hide their identity. The difference between like a North Korean accent, dialect, it would be, and South Korean would be maybe the differences between like an American accent and a British accent, where you can understand each other, but there are definitely words that are different, and you can immediately see that here it's different. Young North Koreans are really good at quickly changing their accent, and that's the role of like South Korean dramas and content being disseminated in the country has played a huge role. And so what some North Koreans will do is that they will hide the fact, especially when they go to university, hide the fact that they are from North Korea, and then only in the last semester they'll tell their friends that they are from North Korea. So there's a term that is sometimes used, it's called "북밍아웃," where "북" is North, and so you say you come out to be a North Korean, like you would come out with your sexual orientation. And so that's something that we hear about, especially with the younger North Koreans. In terms of what our organization does, we hope that the education programs and the exhibition is a response for South Koreans being able to understand North Korea and the people that come from North Korea a little bit more. But then directly with the victims, I think something that we're trying to do a little bit more is, I mean, the psychosocial support is a really big part, but it often also only responds to, we say, the most, like the minority of the most vulnerable group of North Korean escapees. But thinking about in terms of more like leadership positions that North Korean escapees can take. So something that we just started a few years ago is creating a scholarship program for people who want to do post-grad studies, because they do their undergrad for free, but for them to continue with their education and be able to connect with different mentors in the community. It's something that we have been doing not long enough to say how effective it is, but one of the lawyer that I showed you before is one of the people who has gone through that program, and he went from being a recipient to now being one of my many board members. He's on our boards now, so he's taken like a very different role in the community. But it is, I do think there are other organizations who do really excellent work with refugee empowerment. And one organization, especially if you want to learn a little bit more about North Korea, apart from the resources that I've shared with you through our website, is this organization called Liberty in North Korea. Their CEO is also called Hanna, which is very confusing, but they produce really great documentaries on North Korean people. One that they produced quite a few years ago is called the Changmadang generation, the market generation, and it's about young North Koreans who have just come to South Korea. So I would really recommend that as a resource.
Sadly, we're at the end. Hanna has been so generous, not only with her time, but she's also brought some postcards and also some really lovely Korean honey cookies that you should take with you as you leave. But please join me in thanking Hanna for coming and sharing her time. Thank you all for coming.